The night the news broke, the world witnessed something it never expected to see again. Libya, a nation whose future had been sealed by foreign intervention more than a decade ago, was suddenly back at the center of Africa's political storm. A single image, a single confirmation, and the continent felt a tremor that stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the red earth of the Sahel. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, long silent and believed by many to have faded from history, had stepped back into the light. For millions across Africa, his return was not a simple headline. It was the reopening of a memory of what Libya once was and what it lost. And for those who have watched the hidden architecture of power on this continent, it signaled the beginning of something far larger than one man's reappearance. Across West Africa and in diaspora communities from New York to Paris, conversations shifted instantly. Some asked whether Libya had reached a turning point. Others wondered if the return of a Gaddafi might shift alliances again. But a deeper question emerged when the first strong reaction did not come from Tripoli. It came from Ouagadougou, where Burkina Faso's captain Ibrahim Traore broke his silence after watching Libya's slow unraveling for years. The narrator pauses, letting the significance sink in, before Traore's voice enters with a calm firmness shaped by the memory of Libya's fall. He says he speaks because the world has reached a moment it never prepared for. He calls Saif Gaddafi's return more than a political event. It is a reminder of what Libya was building, what Africa was denied, and what foreign powers tried to bury beneath narratives of disorder. Traore warns that the continent should not misread this moment. He says the struggles of Libya and the Sahel are tied to the same forces, the same pressures, and the same efforts to keep Africa from defining its own future. He rises from Burkina Faso with a generation that rejects submission. Saif rises from Libya with memories the world tried to erase, and together, their presence exposes a truth long avoided. Africa is stepping into a new era, and the world is uneasy. What happens next depends on how Africa understands this moment and whether it is prepared for the return of forces that once carried the weight of a nation. Libya is awakening again, and with that awakening comes a question that will shape the future of the continent and the interests of global powers watching closely. The events surrounding Saif al-Islam Gaddafi's re-emergence did not begin with a public announcement or a carefully coordinated campaign. They began in whispers, in quiet observations from diplomats, in messages exchanged between analysts who had been monitoring Libya's fragmented political landscape for years. Libya had been drifting without a center of gravity since 2011, a nation torn apart by militias, foreign agendas, and competing governments that never found enough stability to claim legitimacy. For many outside observers, Libya had simply become a collapsed state that no longer shaped regional affairs. But inside Africa, especially among those who remembered the Libya that once existed, there was always a sense that something unfinished remained in the country's political story. When the first hints of Saif al-Islam's return surfaced, it sent a ripple through North Africa and quickly reached the Sahel. This was not an ordinary political figure. This was the son of a leader whose rule still defined Libya's most stable era in the eyes of many Africans. And stability is a powerful memory in a region where insecurity has spread for more than a decade. Libya before 2011 was far from perfect, but it had built infrastructure that connected cities, funded housing projects, supported education, and invested heavily in African development. It hosted migrant workers, backed African Union initiatives, and in many ways stood as a financial pillar for the continent. This is what foreign powers feared, and this is why Traore's voice adds weight to the moment. He recalls that Libya was a nation moving toward full sovereignty, a nation that refused to be shaped by outside agendas. In his words, Libya understood the meaning of independence long before many dared to speak it openly. Traore reminds his listeners that the fall of Libya did not happen because the country lacked strength. It happened because that strength threatened a global system built on an Africa that remained divided and dependent. As Saif's return became more visible, analysts noted that the timing was remarkable. The Sahel was experiencing its own wave of realignment. Burkina Faso under Traore, along with Mali and Niger, had pushed foreign military forces out of their territories and began building new regional alliances focused on sovereignty. The message of these movements was simple: Africa must shape its own destiny. It was within this backdrop that Saif resurfaced, and the symbolism was impossible to ignore. A powerful figure from Libya's past stepped forward, at the same time a younger generation in the Sahel was challenging decades of foreign influence. Narrator commentary explains that this convergence was what sent shockwaves through global institutions. Western intelligence agencies had assumed Saif would never re-enter the political arena. His silence had been interpreted as defeat. But Traore's interpretation was different. He says a leader who remains silent in chaos is not defeated. He is observing. He is calculating. He is preparing for a moment when the political terrain becomes favorable again. The fact that Saif returned now, at a time when Africa's sovereignty movements are gaining momentum, indicates that Libya's internal forces may also be experiencing a shift. Tribes tired of foreign interference, communities exhausted by militia rule, and young Libyans who grew up in a nation without direction are beginning to seek a path toward stability. They do not look to the West for that stability. They look to their own history. The narrator highlights that this is where the crisis turns into a larger geopolitical event. Libya's collapse reshaped the entire region. Arms flowed into the Sahel. Terror groups gained mobility. Borders became porous. Smuggling networks expanded. West Africa paid a severe price for Libya's destruction. If Libya now begins to move toward unity under a figure who carries both name recognition and political weight, the balance of power across North Africa and the Sahel could change rapidly. Traore voices what many African leaders whisper privately. He says foreign governments do not fear a leader who rises from chaos. They fear the version of Africa that emerges if such a leader succeeds. For Traore, Saif's return is part of a broader moment when Africa is rediscovering the right to define itself without permission. He ties Libya's story to the Sahel's struggle, arguing that the forces that targeted Libya are the same ones attempting to weaken Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger today. As Saif gains visibility again, foreign governments feel the tremor of an old fear. A strong Libya could return, and a strong Libya changes everything for Africa. The narrator closes by reflecting on how extraordinary it is for two movements separated by geography and history to rise at the same time. Saif from the ruins of a fractured state, Traore from a region long treated as expendable. Together, their emergence signals that Africa's political map is not settling. It is shifting. the moment Saif al-Islam Gaddafi's return became undeniable. The political temperature across North Africa and the Sahel shifted instantly. It was not a slow response. It was a surge, a sudden tightening of attention from governments, intelligence services, regional alliances, and foreign observers who had spent more than a decade assuming Libya's political landscape would remain fractured indefinitely. In Tripoli, the first reaction was confusion. Competing factions that had fought for influence since 2011 now found themselves facing a figure who did not belong to any of their camps, but who carried more symbolic weight than any of them. Tribal elders began calling emergency meetings. Militia leaders quietly reassessed their alliances. Young Libyans who had known nothing but conflict watched Saif's reappearance with curiosity, wondering whether this was the beginning of a different kind of political chapter. But the most intense reaction did not come from Libya. It came from abroad. In European capitals, analysts quickly drafted internal memos warning that Saif's return could disrupt years of policy designed to keep Libya divided enough to be manageable. In Washington, think tanks updated their assessments of North African stability, noting that the re-emergence of a Gaddafi figure could realign regional power. Western media outlets, which had spent years portraying Libya as permanently broken, scrambled to reframe Saif before he could define himself. The narrator explains that this scramble was not about information, it was about influence. Whoever defines Saif first shapes the global narrative, and global narratives often determine which governments support or oppose a rising political force. In Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traore responded with precision. He did not wait for foreign commentary to dictate meaning. He stepped forward to interpret the moment for Africa itself. Traore declared that Saif's return revealed a truth foreign powers hoped Africans would never remember. Libya did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it threatened a system built on African dependence. His message resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. Across the Sahel, radio stations replayed his statement. In villages in Mali and Niger, elders nodded in recognition. They had lived through the collapse of Libya and understood the consequences better than anyone. Traore's voice carried the tone of someone who had studied the pattern closely. He reminded listeners that every African nation that asserts sovereignty becomes a target of pressure. He said the fear expressed by foreign governments was not fear of instability, but fear of an Africa able to define itself. As his words spread, reactions intensified. In Algeria and Tunisia, analysts debated whether Libya's political landscape was about to shift toward a unified structure that could negotiate from a position of strength. In Chad and Sudan, governments monitored troop movements along borders, aware that any upheaval in Libya could trigger migration surges or militia realignments. Meanwhile, in West Africa, citizens drew a direct connection between Saif's rise and the sovereignty movements in the Sahel. They saw two forces emerging at the same time, one rooted in Libya's past, the other rising from the Sahel's present. Together, these movements suggested a continental awakening that could reshape alliances across Africa. The narrator emphasizes that the real peak of the crisis was not political. It was psychological. For the first time in years, Libya felt like a nation with potential direction instead of endless fragmentation. And for the first time in years, foreign governments realized their influence over Libya might no longer be guaranteed. This realization created a sense of urgency that spilled into diplomatic channels. Countries that once dismissed Libya's internal affairs began urging calm. They warned of political volatility. They cautioned against sudden shifts. But their statements revealed something deeper. They were worried. They understood that a Libya regaining its footing could upset the balance that had allowed external actors to shape the region for more than a decade. Traore responded directly to this anxiety. He spoke not as a critic, but as a witness to the consequences of Libya's collapse. He reminded Africa that when Libya fell, the Sahel descended into crisis. Terror groups expanded across borders. Arms flooded the region. Smuggling networks strengthened. He said the world never acknowledged that Libya's fall reshaped Africa. But he insisted Africa must acknowledge it now because the reappearance of Saif al-Islam signaled that the cycle could reverse. The narrator explains that this is where the story reaches its emotional peak. The continent recognized that Libya's tragedy had not been random. It had been structural. And now its potential recovery could also be structural. It could realign power in ways foreign actors were not prepared to manage. As citizens across Africa discussed Saif's return in markets, mosques, homes, and universities, the larger question began to take shape. What if Libya does not remain broken? What if Libya rises again? And if it does, what will that mean for the rest of Africa? The world was not ready for that question. But Africa was beginning to ask it. As Saif al-Islam Gaddafi's return echoed across the continent, the effects were felt far beyond political councils and military headquarters. Ordinary people, from the crowded streets of Tripoli to the small border towns of Niger and the marketplaces of Ouagadougou, began to sense that something fundamental was shifting. For many Libyans who had grown up in a country caught between rival militias and fragmented governments, Saif's presence signaled a possibility they had not allowed themselves to consider for years. Some spoke quietly of stability. Others felt a cautious hope that Libya might someday move past the chaos that had defined their lives since 2011. The narrator explains that these emotions were not abstract. They stemmed from lived experiences. A shopkeeper in Misrata told reporters that his son had never known a functional state, only checkpoints and power outages. A teacher in Saba said her students believed Libya had always been divided because they had no memory of what it meant to live under a unified national administration. For families who had lost relatives to militia violence or migration routes across the Mediterranean, the idea of Libya regaining its voice was deeply personal. But the return of a Gaddafi figure also reopened old wounds. Some feared that history might repeat itself. Others worried that Saif's rise would trigger new rivalries among armed groups competing for influence. The narrator observes that these conflicting emotions were not a sign of instability. They were a sign of a nation remembering itself. Outside Libya, the consequences were equally significant. In the Sahel, the story of Libya's collapse had been told for more than a decade through the lens of insecurity. Weapons from Libyan stockpiles had flowed into extremist networks. Border communities had lived under constant threat. The fall of Libya had been the spark that ignited a chain reaction across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. For people in these regions, Saif's return forced them to revisit a question they had carried quietly for years. If Libya broke the region when it fell, could it help rebuild the region if it rose again? Traore addressed this directly. He reminded Africans that Libya had once funded infrastructure, supported regional security, and backed economic initiatives that strengthened the continent. He said the lesson of 2011 was that Africa's stability is interconnected and that a strong Libya would always radiate strength into its neighbors. But he also warned that the opposite remained true. If Libya's awakening triggered conflict among external actors trying to maintain influence, the Sahel could once again become the front line of geopolitical competition. This warning resonated deeply. In Niger and Mali, officials tightened border patrols. Communities in northern Burkina Faso, already living through insecurity, wondered whether new armed groups might attempt to exploit political uncertainty in Libya. The narrator notes that these fears were rooted in reality. History had shown that whenever Libya experienced internal divisions, those divisions spilled into neighboring states. Smuggling networks expanded. Extremist groups found new havens. Migrants fleeing one crisis created pressure on countries already struggling with their own challenges. The potential for a similar cycle worried many. Yet the possibility of a different cycle, one of reconstruction and continental cooperation, also began to take shape. Some regional leaders considered the idea that a stable Libya could help anchor a new political order in North Africa and the Sahel. Younger activists in Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou circulated messages online calling Saif's return a chance for Africa to reclaim lost momentum. They said that if Libya stood up again, Africa would stand up with it. Traore emphasized that the real test would not be how Libya's elites reacted, but how its institutions handled the moment. He said a nation becomes vulnerable when its leaders are divided, its military is compromised, or its political class serves interests that do not belong to the people. He warned that no foreign power could destabilize a united nation, and that Libya's path forward would depend on whether it could close the internal cracks that had allowed intervention in the first place. The narrator reflects on how profound this moment was for Africa. It was not merely the return of a political figure. It was the return of a question that had shaped the continent for decades. Could an African nation that defied external control rebuild itself without becoming a target again? And if Libya does manage to stabilize, how will global powers respond to a nation they once worked so hard to reshape? These civil and political consequences stretched far beyond Libya's borders. They reached every African community that had lived with the aftermath of Libya's fall. And now they watched closely, wondering whether this awakening might finally reverse the cycle that had defined an entire generation. From the moment Saif al-Islam Gaddafi re-entered the public arena, major world powers began reassessing their long-held assumptions about Libya and the region surrounding it. In Washington, the reaction was swift and guarded. Analysts who had spent years treating Libya as a fractured state suddenly faced the possibility that a figure with both political memory and public recognition might bring coherence to a landscape they believed would remain divided. Internal reports circulated through policy groups warning that Saif's return could challenge American influence in North Africa, particularly if Libya aligned itself more closely with sovereignty-driven movements in the Sahel. For the United States, the concern was not simply whether Saif could stabilize Libya. It was whether his rise would create a unified political force capable of negotiating without reliance on Western institutions. American officials understood that a Libya able to act independently would change energy relationships, migration routes, and counterterrorism strategies across the Mediterranean. The narrator adds that the most revealing reactions came from Europe. Countries that had championed the intervention of 2000 now faced the uncomfortable reminder that their actions had reshaped the region in ways they could not fully control. European diplomats issued cautious statements urging restraint and dialogue, but beneath their measured tone lay a deeper fear. A Libya that stabilizes on its own terms challenges the political justification for years of involvement. A Libya that strengthens its ties to African-led initiatives reduces Europe's ability to shape regional decisions. In Paris and Rome, private discussions highlighted concerns that Saif could rebuild the networks Libya once maintained across the continent, networks that empowered African states to pursue agendas independent of European oversight. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, reactions were more pragmatic. Countries that had supported different Libyan factions studied Saif's reappearance with a mix of caution and opportunity. They understood that if Saif gained traction, the political landscape could realign around him, potentially diminishing their leverage, but also offering new channels of influence if managed carefully. The African Union responded with restrained optimism. Several member states saw Saif's return as a potential turning point that could help restore Libya's role in continental affairs. They also recognized that his presence might inspire more assertive sovereignty movements across the Sahel, which had already begun redefining Africa's relationship with the outside world. Traore captured this global unease in a single observation. He noted that foreign powers do not react strongly to a nation in chaos. They react to a nation that shows signs of recovering its strength. And Libya, after years of silence, was beginning to move again. For Washington, for Europe, and for every regional power invested in North Africa, the question was no longer whether Saif would return. It was what Libya would become now that he had. As Libya stands at this pivotal crossroads, the world is watching to see which path the nation will choose and what that choice will mean for an entire continent that has carried the weight of its collapse for more than a decade. Saif al-Islam. Gaddafi's return did not resolve the crisis, but it forced a long-avoided question back into the center of global attention. What happens when a nation that was pushed into silence decides to speak again? One future remains the one foreign powers quietly prefer. A Libya kept divided, suspended between rival authorities, unable to negotiate from a position of strength, and too fractured to challenge the global order that solidified after 2011. The other future is the one Saif symbolizes, a Libya capable of unity, rebuilding its institutions, and re-entering African politics with the influence it once held. A Libya that remembers its strength cannot be easily controlled, and a Libya that stands again becomes a force that shifts regional dynamics, security strategies, and foreign calculations. The narrator reflects that the stakes extend far beyond Libya's borders. The Sahel has already entered a new era, driven by leaders like Ibrahim Traore, who insist that sovereignty is not granted, but defended. If Libya manages to rise alongside the Sahel, Africa may experience its most significant political realignment in generations. But with opportunity comes risk. If Libya moves toward unity too quickly without stabilizing its internal fractures, external powers may attempt once again to influence the outcome. And if Libya fails to consolidate this moment, the region could enter another cycle of instability that would reverberate across Africa and reach as far as Europe and the United States. This is why the next months will be decisive. If Libya does not strengthen its institutions, secure its borders, and reconcile its political factions, foreign actors will find the cracks they need to reassert influence. But if Libya succeeds in organizing itself, a new geopolitical landscape may emerge across the Mediterranean and the Sahel. For many viewers, especially those who remember the world before 2011, this moment may feel familiar, like the return of a question that never truly disappeared. What does a strong Libya mean for Africa and for the world? And more importantly, is the world prepared for a Libya that does not ask for permission to define its future? If this story has stirred something in you, a sense of concern for global stability, or a hope that nations can reclaim their own destiny, let that reflection guide your thoughts as this new chapter unfolds. Sometimes the most important changes begin quietly, not with declarations, but with a nation rediscovering its voice. As Libya prepares to choose its path, may wisdom guide its leaders, may clarity strengthen its people, and may peace take root where conflict once lived. And for all of us watching from afar, may we recognize that when one nation rises, it reminds others that their voice was never truly lost.